In this video, I'm going to give you a demo and an introduction to the virtual network data gateway. So the first question you would ask is, what is it? What does it do? And effectively, from an infrastructure point of view, it's a container that Microsoft deploy. So it's a fully managed container that would deploy into a virtual network subnet that you delegate to the Power Platform service. And so what this does is it allows Power Platform and Power BI to access Azure data sources that are secured with things like private endpoints. So if you've got something like an Azure SQL database, blob, Azure table storage, and you have public access that has been denied, which is often the case with enterprise customers, as long as you've got private endpoints or service endpoints enabled for the virtual network that this managed container gets deployed into, you can now access those data sources. So if you've got a Power BI report that has a data source for an Azure SQL database that doesn't have public access, you can now still access it via Power BI. So I'm going to show you how that works, and I've got this deployed. So if I flip over to the Azure portal and I go into Azure SQL, okay, so I've got a SQL server and a SQL database. If I go to the SQL server and I go into the networking section, so we can see that public network access is being denied. So I don't have any service endpoints enabled. But if I go into private endpoint connections, we see that I do have a private endpoint connection. And in that I've got a database called Liam Demo, and I've got like one row of sample data in there. So if I now go into my virtual networks, and if I go into my BA Hub network and go into subnets, you'll see that I have created a subnet for what I've called it the Power BI Gateway subnet. And one thing to note is that you have to delegate that to the Microsoft.Power Platform VNET access links. I've also got a private endpoint subnet, and within there is the private endpoint NIC for that database I just showed you. So I have a VNET, I've got a private endpoint in there. I've also got another subnet where this container for the virtual network data gateway would be deployed into. This all works, but it won't work without DNS. So for my private endpoint connection, I have a private DNS zone for privatelink.database.windows.net. And if I go into that, you'll see that my server is here, building Azure.database.windows.net. This won't work unless I set up a virtual network link. So remember, this was in the BA Hub West Europe. I've linked that private DNS zone to the same VNet where this managed container would be deploy into. So that's how it's able to resolve the name. So once you do that and you've got the subnet created, you actually have to go into the Power Platform Admin Center, which is admin.powerplatform.microsoft.com. And if you go into the data preview section here, you'll see you've got two choices: on-premise data gateways and this new virtual network data gateways. So with this virtual network data gateways, I went in here and I created a virtual network data gateway. If you can't see the ability to create it, you have to untick this tenant administration and go back into virtual network data gateways, and you'll see that it's there. If I go into settings, you can see how I've set it up. There's a little checker here to make sure that it's online, so the container has actually been deployed and it's online. Once that's been there, the way I want to demo this is actually through Power BI. You can actually do this with just Power Platform and create data flows now that that's been set up. But for Power BI, I go in here and I've got if you need to have Power BI Premium for this to work, at least currently. So in Power BI, I've got a premium workspace, as you can see here, and I've got a data set and I've got a report. So if I go into the data set, click on settings, Okay, so this data set is actually been set up. If you go into gateway connections, we see that I've ticked a box to say use an on-premise or VNet data gateway. Interestingly, it says you don't need a gateway for this data set because the data sources are in the cloud. That is true because it's an Azure SQL database. However, public network access has been disabled. So that message is a little bit misleading. So I absolutely need to tick this box, and we can see then I can map it back to my data connection, which I've got set up here. To show you that as well, if you go up to the settings, you've got manage gateways up here. And we can see we've got a gateway cluster. If I expand that out, we can see that I've created my connection to my Azure SQL database. I'm just using SQL authentication, so I've got a username and password, and I've also made it available to myself as a user. So what this means is I can go into my report, and we can see I've just created the most basic Power BI report, but we can see here that it's returning the one row of data. Now, if I flip back into Azure and go back, and I'll have a look at this database again. Just as a recap, just remember the magic is the fact that public network access is disabled. I can add service endpoints here, and that would work too. But with this one, I am going through my private endpoint connection. So if I go into the database itself, and if I go into query editor, just so you can verify the data, I just need to log in. Okay, and if I go to tables, I've got a persons table. If I just select up 1000 rows, we can see the data matches. So we know that this is accessing via the public SaaS Power BI is accessing an Azure data source that is entirely private. And that's the magic of this service. You can achieve this with getting an on-premise data gateway and deploying it into your Azure VNet, and that is the supported, let's say the generally available way of doing that currently. The advantage of using the virtual network data gateway is that it's a service that's managed entirely by Microsoft. So you delegate the subnet to the Microsoft Power Platform.VNet access links, and we deploy the container, and you don't have to worry about the management and overhead of that, because if you're using the on-premise data gateway, effectively you'd have to have a virtual machine running, which you can turn off to save money, but then your users won't be able to access the data. So this way is a lot easier to manage. Hopefully that makes sense. Thank you.